On the evening of April 14, 1982, a 7-year-old boy in Leningrad unknowingly heard a conversation that would result in his parents' execution. His name was Dmitry Kazakov. His father, Anatoly, held a mid-level engineering position at a defense research facility in the city. His mother, Elena, taught literature at a local school. By all accounts, they were ordinary Soviet citizens, the kind of family who kept a low profile, adhered to rules, and avoided trouble. However, in early 1982, they made a life-altering decision. They chose to defect. The specific circumstances leading to this decision are not entirely clear. What is known is that Anatoly and Elena had received approval for a family vacation to Bulgaria in late May of that year. Bulgaria was part of the Eastern Bloc, a safe destination for Soviet citizens, and the approval process for such trips was routine. However, the Kazakovs had no intention of returning. According to later interrogation records, their plan was to cross into Yugoslavia while in Bulgaria and from there make their way to Austria, where they hoped to seek asylum in the West. This plan necessitated absolute secrecy. Any disclosure, any suspicion, any hint that they were planning a permanent departure would have been enough to trigger an investigation. And that is precisely what transpired. To comprehend why the Kazakovs desired to leave, it's essential to understand life in the Soviet Union in 1982. This was the concluding phase of the Brezhnev era, a period historians refer to as the era of stagnation. The economy was flagging, consumer goods were scarce, and the rigid ideology that had characterized Soviet life for decades was beginning to feel stifling to many citizens, particularly those with an education and exposure to ideas beyond state propaganda. Anatoly Kazakov had been employed at the Leningrad Defense Research Facility since 1976. His role involved designing components for radio communication equipment used in military applications. It was not top-secret work. He wasn't developing weapon systems or working on nuclear technology. Nonetheless, it was sensitive enough that his employment file was maintained by the facility's security department, and his movements were subject to periodic review. Employees in the defense sector were always subjected to closer scrutiny than ordinary citizens. The state considered them valuable assets, but also potential security risks. Elena taught 5th and 6th grade literature. By 1982, she had been teaching for 9 years, and according to former colleagues interviewed years later, she was well-liked by her students and respected by the administration. However, teaching in the Soviet Union meant carefully balancing the encouragement of critical thinking with the avoidance of anything that might be construed as ideological deviation. Everything was politicized. Every book, every discussion, every interpretation had to conform to party doctrine. They had one child, Dmitry, born in October 1974. He was a quiet boy, somewhat shy, according to his teachers, but intelligent and inquisitive. He attended school number 47 in the Frunze district, where his mother also taught, though not in his grade level. His friends described him in later interviews as loyal and trustworthy, the kind of child who took promises seriously. The Kazakovs resided in a typical Soviet apartment complex on Bukarestskaya Street, a concrete block structure constructed in the 1960s as part of Khrushchev's mass housing initiative. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen, and a bathroom with unreliable hot water. It was characteristic for a family of 3 in Leningrad at that time. Their neighbors were a mix of workers, teachers, low-level bureaucrats, and pensioners. The walls were thin. Privacy was a luxury no one truly possessed. Dmitry later recounted to his grandmother, in one of the few conversations they had about that period, that he had been listening at his parents' bedroom door when he overheard them discussing the trip. He said he had noticed something was different in the weeks leading up to that night. His parents had been tense, speaking in hushed tones that ceased when he entered the room. There had been prolonged silences at dinner. His mother had been distracted, forgetting to inquire about his school day or check his homework. That night, he heard them discussing Bulgaria, the vacation for which they had received approval. But they weren't talking about sightseeing or beaches. They were talking about Yugoslavia, about crossing the border, about someone who could assist them once they arrived. His father's voice was urgent. His mother sounded scared, but she was agreeing. She mentioned something about not being able to raise their son in a place where his future was already predetermined for him. Dmitry didn't grasp everything they were saying, but he understood enough. They were talking about leaving and not returning. They were talking about the West. His parents caught him listening. According to Dmitry, his father pulled him into the room and very clearly told him that he needed to forget what he had heard. His mother was in tears. They made him promise not to tell anyone. They explained that it was just idle vacation talk, nothing serious, but that he absolutely could not repeat it. Not to his friends, not to his teachers, not to anyone. He promised, but promises made by 7-year-olds, even sincere ones, are delicate things. Over the following 2 weeks, Dmitry began to observe things that corroborated what he had overheard. His mother was packing items that made no sense for a vacation. She meticulously folded her mother's lace tablecloth, the one that only appeared for holidays, and placed it in a suitcase. She packed photo albums, not just recent pictures, but old ones, images of family members from before Dmitry was born. She wrapped his father's watch, a family heirloom that had belonged to Anatoly's grandfather, in cloth and tucked it into a side pocket. These were not the actions of people planning a 2-week vacation. These were the actions of people who were leaving permanently. Dmitry understood that, even if he didn't fully comprehend why, and the weight of that understanding, combined with the secret he promised to keep, must have been immense for a child of that age. In mid-May, less than 10 days before the family was scheduled to depart for Bulgaria, Dmitry was playing in the courtyard of his apartment complex with his best friend, an 8-year-old boy named Mikhail Petro. The courtyard was a communal space, a patch of concrete and struggling grass encircled by identical apartment buildings. There was a rusted swing set, a broken slide, and a low wall where the children enjoyed sitting and chatting. The 2 boys had grown up together. They had been neighbors since Dmitry was 2 years old. They had started school together, spent nearly every afternoon playing in that courtyard, and according to people who knew them, considered each other as close as brothers. At some point during that afternoon, Dmitry told Mikhail they were leaving. He said they were going west and not coming back. He said it was goodbye. We don't know precisely how the conversation unfolded. We don't know if Mikhail pressed for details or if Dmitry offered them freely. What we do know is that Mikhail believed him, and that belief was strong enough that he went home that evening and told his parents what his friend had said. And this is where the narrative takes a pivotal turn, because Mikhail's father was a police officer. Viktor Petro was a sergeant in the Leningrad militia. He joined the force in 1970, directly after completing his military service, and had risen through the ranks from patrol officer to a position in the local precinct's administrative section. By all accounts, he was a dedicated officer, a man who believed in order and structure, who viewed his job as upholding the stability of Soviet society. When his son came home with this information, Viktor did not dismiss it as mere children's chatter. According to later reports, he asked Mikhail to repeat verbatim what Dmitry had said. He wanted to know where the conversation had taken place, whether anyone else had overheard it, and whether Mikhail was absolutely certain those were the words his friend had used. Mikhail answered truthfully. He was 8 years old and trusted his father to handle information responsibly. He had no reason to believe that his actions would lead to anything serious. But Viktor Petro was more astute. He knew that Dmitry Kazakov worked in the defense sector because he was familiar with the family and had seen Anatoly leaving for work each morning in his engineer's attire, carrying his identification papers. He understood that defection by a defense employee was regarded as a grave security threat, and he knew that even unverified information of this nature needed to be reported. The following morning, May 16, 1982, Viktor filed a report with his superior officer at the militia station. The report was concise, noting his son Mikhail as the source, acknowledging that the information was second-hand and came from a child, but also highlighting the potential severity if it proved true. He included Anatoly's workplace affiliation and the fact that the family had an approved trip abroad scheduled for May 27th. The report escalated rapidly through the chain of command. Within 24 hours, It had been forwarded from the local militia to the Leningrad branch of the Committee for State Security, the KGB. The KGB received thousands of tips and reports annually. The Soviet system encouraged citizens to inform on one another, and most people understood that reporting suspicious behavior was both a civic duty and a means of protecting oneself from suspicion. The vast majority of these reports led nowhere. Neighbors reported neighbors over minor disputes. Co-workers reported co-workers out of jealousy or ambition. Much of it was inconsequential. However, this particular report contained elements that warranted investigation. First, the subject was a defense sector employee. Although Anatoly's employment position wasn't of high rank, any worker involved in defense who sought to depart the nation was considered a potential breach of security. The primary concern wasn't necessarily that Anatoly possessed critical confidential information, he likely didn't, but rather that his act of defection could establish a precedent, potentially emboldening others and suggesting a weakening of governmental control. Secondly, the family had an approved international trip scheduled, making the timing suspicious. If they intended to defect, their window of opportunity was narrow. However, the third piece of information presented a problem. The source was an 8-year-old child who had reportedly heard it from a 7-year-old. This inherently rendered the information unreliable. Children often misinterpret facts, exaggerate details, or invent stories entirely. The KGB could not simply arrest Dmitry Kazakov based on a rumor circulating between two children. They required corroboration, concrete evidence, and they needed it quickly before the family's departure for Bulgaria. Consequently, they initiated surveillance. The decision to place the Kazakov family under surveillance would have been made at the Leningrad KGB's Second Chief Directorate, which was responsible for internal security and counterintelligence. A case file, numbered 4788K, was opened, and officers were assigned to monitor the family's activities. The surveillance operation, which commenced on May 17, 1982, was fairly standard for this type of situation. Officers were stationed to observe the Kazakov apartment building, noting Anatoly's departure for work and his return. They also tracked Eleonora's movements, following her to the school where she taught, to the market for shopping, and back home in the evenings. A wiretap was placed on the apartment's telephone line, although records indicate the Kazakovs rarely used their phone during this interval. The KGB also scrutinized Anatoly's employment records at the defense facility. They searched for any inconsistencies, signs of disaffection, or ideological deviations. They investigated whether he had made any unusual requests for information, accessed materials outside his typical work scope, or if colleagues had observed anything suspicious. They found nothing particularly alarming. According to all documentation, Anatoly was a competent and unremarkable employee. Yet the surveillance team remained patient. They were looking for something specific: contact with a facilitator, unusual meetings, or preparations that would indicate an intention to defect. And on May 20th, 3 days into the surveillance and 7 days before the family's scheduled departure, they discovered it. Anatoly met with a man at a cafe located near the Neva River. The cafe was a modest establishment, typical for workers stopping for tea on their way home. The meeting took place around 6 p.m. after Anatoly had finished work for the day. He sat at a corner table with a man the surveillance team immediately recognized. The man's name was Grigory Lebedev, and he had a file with the KGB. Lebedev was suspected of being a facilitator, an individual who helped orchestrate illegal border crossings for Soviet citizens attempting to defect. He had been under intermittent surveillance for over a year. However, the KGB had never amassed sufficient evidence to arrest him. He was cautious, met with people briefly, and rarely stayed in one place long enough to be caught in an explicitly illegal act. The meeting between Anatoly and Lebedev lasted less than 10 minutes. They conversed quietly, their heads close together. No documents were exchanged that the surveillance team could observe. When they parted, they did so quickly, without any gestures that might imply familiarity. But the meeting itself was enough. Combined with the tip from Viktor Petrov, it constituted sufficient evidence of intent. The KGB acted swiftly thereafter. There was no time for further surveillance, no opportunity to gather additional evidence. The family was scheduled to leave for Bulgaria in 7 days. If the Kazakovs managed to board that train, if they crossed into Bulgaria and from there into Yugoslavia, the KGB would lose them. And losing a defense sector employee to the West would be both an intelligence failure and a propaganda disaster. On the evening of May 21, 1982, 2 black Volga sedans pulled up in front of the apartment complex on Bukarestskaya Street. 6 KGB officers, all in plain clothes, entered the building and ascended the stairs to the 3rd floor. Several neighbors later recounted what transpired next. There was a heavy knock on the Kazakov apartment door. When Anatoly opened it, the officers identified themselves and informed him he needed to accompany them for questioning. Elena appeared behind him, demanding to know what was happening, what the charges were. The officers instructed her that she also needed to come. Dmitry was inside the apartment. According to one neighbor who was in the hallway at the time, the boy was brought out by one of the officers, visibly bewildered and calling for his mother. Elena attempted to reach him, but the officers separated them. Dmitry was placed in a different vehicle than his parents. He never saw them again. Anatoly and Elena Kazakov were transported to separate detention facilities operated by the KGB. Dmitry was taken to a state children's facility on the outskirts of the city, a place where children whose parents were arrested or deemed unsuitable were temporarily housed while their cases underwent processing. The interrogations of Anatoly and Eleonora commenced immediately. Interrogation techniques employed by the KGB during this period are extensively documented. They involved isolation, sleep deprivation, psychological pressure, and repetitive questioning designed to erode resistance and extract confessions. The interrogators would have had the surveillance evidence, the meeting with Lebedev, the phone tap records, and whatever else they had gathered during the brief surveillance operation. But they would have desired more. They would have sought a full confession, detailed information about the plan, and the names of any other individuals involved. Anatoly resisted for 3 days, according to the interrogation logs later recovered from the archives. He initially denied any intent to defect, claimed the meeting with Lebedev was coincidental, and maintained that the trip to Bulgaria was merely a vacation. However, on the 4th day of interrogation, he confessed the truth. He admitted that he and Elena had been planning to defect for approximately 4 months. He stated they had established contact with Lebedev through an acquaintance whose name he refused to disclose. He explained that the plan was to travel to Bulgaria as approved, then cross into Yugoslavia on foot through a mountain pass that Lebedev had identified. From Yugoslavia, they intended to make their way to Austria and claim asylum at an American or British embassy. He acknowledged that he understood this was illegal, that he was betraying the Soviet Union, but he insisted that he had done it for his son. He said he wanted Dmitry to grow up in a place where he could think freely, speak freely, where his future was not dictated by party membership and ideological conformity. He stated he was willing to accept whatever punishment the state deemed appropriate, but he requested that his wife be spared, asserting that she had only agreed to the plan because he had insisted. However, the interrogators disregarded that request. Elena was interrogated separately and corroborated Anatoly's confession. She admitted that she had known about the plan, had agreed to it, and had participated in the preparations. She told them about the items she had packed, the photo albums and heirlooms, the things she could not bear to leave behind. Under Soviet law at the time, attempted defection by a defense sector employee was classified as treason under Article 64 of the RSFSR Criminal Code. The article defined treason as an act intentionally committed by a citizen of the USSR to the detriment of the state independence, territorial integrity, or military might of the USSR. Defection fell under this category, particularly when the individual had access to any kind of sensitive information or worked in a sector related to state security. The penalty for treason was death. There was no ambiguity in the law, no allowance for mitigating circumstances. Intent was sufficient for conviction. The fact that Anatoly and Eleonora had not yet actually defected, that they had been arrested before boarding the train to Bulgaria, made no difference under the legal framework. The trial was held in a closed military tribunal on June 28, 1982. These tribunals were not public proceedings. No journalists were present, no outside observers. The proceedings were only recorded in written form, and the records were classified immediately upon completion. The trial lasted approximately 4 hours. The prosecution presented the evidence, the surveillance reports, the documentation of the meeting with Lebedev, and the signed confessions. No defense was mounted, which was typical in treason cases of this nature. The concept of presumption of innocence, while theoretically a part of Soviet law, was functionally irrelevant in cases involving state security. The verdict was delivered the same day. Both Anatoly Kazakov and Elena Kazakov were found guilty of treason under Article 64. They were sentenced to death by firing squad. There was no appeal process for treason convictions in cases involving state security. The sentence was final. On July 2, 1982, at approximately 6 a.m., Anatoly and Elena Kazakov were executed at a facility outside Leningrad. The executions were carried out by a military firing squad, which was standard procedure for treason cases. Their bodies were not returned to the family. They were buried in unmarked graves at an undisclosed location. Their deaths were not announced publicly. No obituary appeared in any newspaper. Their names were removed from official records wherever possible. The apartment on Bukarestskaya Street was reassigned to another family within 2 weeks. The defense establishment where Anatoly was employed made no declaration, offered no acknowledgement of his past tenure there. To all intents and purposes, Anatoly and Elena Kazakov ceased their existence. Meanwhile, Dmitry had been placed within the state's welfare framework. The facility to which he was initially transported served as a temporary holding area. Within a week of his parents' apprehension, he was relocated to a children's institution in the Novgorod region, approximately 200 kilometers from Leningrad. His grandmother, Anatoly's mother, arrived at the Leningrad facility 4 days subsequent to the arrest. Her name was Klavdia Kazakova, and she was 63 years of age at that time. She had been a widow for 7 years, residing on a modest pension in a communal dwelling within the Moskovsky district. Upon learning of her son and daughter-in-law's arrest, she immediately approached the authorities to petition for Dmitry's custody. Her request was denied. The rationale, according to documents later retrieved from state archives, was that children of convicted traitors necessitated specialized supervision to guarantee appropriate ideological re-education. The state considered these children susceptible to inheriting their parents' anti-Soviet tendencies, and the standard procedure involved placing them in state-operated facilities, where their education and development could be meticulously overseen. Klavdia was permitted to visit Dmitry, but exclusively under supervision and only at pre-arranged intervals. She was not allowed to take him home. She appealed the decision repeatedly over the ensuing months, submitting letters to various bureaucratic departments, imploring administrators, and insisting that she was a loyal Soviet citizen capable of providing a suitable upbringing for her grandson. Every appeal was rejected. The last occasion she saw Dmitry as a child was in August of 1982 at the children's home in Novgorod. She had traveled by train to visit him, bringing a small bag of sweets and a photograph of a young Anatoly. Dmitry inquired about his parents' whereabouts. She was at a loss for words. The authorities had not informed her of the execution, merely stating that the case was closed and that Anatoly and Elena would not be returning. She told Dmitry his parents were away and would come back when they were able. It was a falsehood, but she knew no other reply to offer a 7-year-old boy. Dmitry spent the subsequent 11 years within the state care system. He was moved between various facilities multiple times, a common practice designed to prevent children from forming strong attachments to particular locations or staff members. He resided in Novgorod, then returned to a facility on the outskirts of Leningrad. He was enrolled in state schools, received a basic education, and was instructed in the standard Soviet curriculum. Individuals who knew him during those years characterized him as withdrawn and quiet. He did not readily form friendships, eschewed group activities, and spent most of his leisure time reading or sitting in solitude. Teachers observed that he was intelligent but lacked motivation, adequately completing assignments but displaying no particular enthusiasm for anything. His grandmother visited whenever possible, though these visits became less frequent as she aged and her health deteriorated. The emotional toll of losing her son and being unable to care for her grandson weighed heavily upon her. She wrote letters to Dmitry when she could not visit, though she never ascertained if he received them all. When Dmitry reached 18 years of age in October of 1992, he was released from state oversight. The Soviet Union had collapsed the preceding year, and the system that had separated him from his family no longer existed in its former configuration. He was provided with a modest stipend, assigned a room in a communal apartment in St. Petersburg, the city that had been Leningrad during his parents' lifetime, and instructed to register with the local employment office. He secured employment as a stock clerk in a warehouse. It was unskilled labor, poorly compensated, the type of occupation requiring no qualifications and offering no advancement opportunities. He lived alone, rarely engaged with his neighbors, and by all accounts remained reclusive. However, he was seeking something. He endeavored to discover what had transpired with his parents. In the early months of 1993, Dmitry began navigating the bureaucratic remnants of the Soviet system, attempting to access information that had been sealed for over a decade. He visited government offices, submitted requests for records, and posed questions that most clerks were either unable or unwilling to answer. Many archives were in disarray following the USSR's collapse. Files had been relocated, lost, or intentionally destroyed. The KGB had been dissolved and reorganized into new agencies, and many former KGB officers were disinclined to discuss cases from the Soviet era. Yet Dmitry was persistent. He submitted formal requests under new transparency laws enacted in the early 1990s, statutes that theoretically permitted citizens to access information concerning their families. He resorted to untruths when necessary, claiming a need for medical records, asserting that he was conducting historical research, alleging anything that might persuade a bureaucrat to assist him. In early September of 1993, he finally found someone willing to investigate. Her name has not been preserved in any records, but according to accounts pieced together from Dmitry's grandmother, she was a middle-aged woman working in a records department that managed archived KGB files. She took pity on Dmitry, recognizing him as a young man attempting to comprehend his family's fate, and agreed to search for the file after hours when the office was empty. She located the case file. She gently informed Dmitry that his parents had been apprehended in May of 1982, charged with treason, and executed in July of that same year. She presented him with the dates, the charges, the verdict. She did not reveal the complete file. Much of it remained technically classified, but she furnished him with sufficient information to grasp the events. And then she explained how the arrest had been initiated. She clarified that the case had been triggered by a report filed by a militia officer named Viktor Petrov, whose source was his 8-year-old son, Mikhail. She elaborated that Mikhail had overheard the information from Dmitry himself, that the tip had led to surveillance, and that the surveillance had resulted in the arrest. Dmitry required no further explanation. He remembered Mikhail. He remembered the afternoon in the courtyard, the conversation on the wall, the words he had uttered. He understood with complete and devastating clarity what he had done. He departed the records office and wandered through the streets of St. Petersburg for hours. The city was still adapting to its post-Soviet identity. The grand facades of the imperial era peered through the grime and neglect of decades. It was early autumn, cold and gray, and Dmitry walked without direction or purpose, replaying everything in his mind. He returned to his room that evening. He did not eat. He sat at the small table and composed a note. The note was concise. It explained what he had learned that day, the cost of his words, and what that signified. He did not blame Mikhail. He did not blame Viktor Petrov. He did not blame the KGB or the Soviet system. He blamed himself. He wrote that he had killed his parents, that he had destroyed his family, and that he could not endure that knowledge. On the night of September 8th, 1993, Dmitry Kazakov hanged himself in his apartment. He was discovered the following morning by his landlord, who had arrived to collect rent. He was 18 years old. The note was found by the police and included with the incident report. His death was officially registered as suicide. Cause of death: asphyxiation. There was no investigation, no follow-up. The Soviet Union was no more. The KGB was gone, and Dmitry Kazakov was merely another casualty in a system that had ceased to exist. His grandmother was informed. She claimed his body and arranged for his burial. She had him interred in a cemetery on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, in a plot near where she believed, though could never confirm, her son and daughter-in-law had been buried. She placed a simple marker with his name and dates. She passed away 14 months later. The sorrow of losing her son, her daughter-in-law, and her grandson within 13 years had fractured something fundamental within her. She was 76 years old when she died. And according to neighbors, she had spent her final year discussing Dmitry constantly, questioning if she could have acted differently, if there had been some way to save him. The narrative of the Kazakov family remained largely unknown for years. Case file 4788K resided in the archives, accessible only to researchers with specific clearance. It was not until the late 1990s, when a Russian journalist investigating KGB cases from the 1980s encountered the file, that the details began to surface. The journalist, whose work was published in a small Russian historical journal in 1998, observed the tragic irony of the case, that a child's innocent utterances had triggered a sequence of events leading to his parents' execution and ultimately his own demise. The article was brief, under 2,000 words, and garnered little attention outside academic circles. However, the Kazakov case transcends the tragedy of a single family. It illustrates how the Soviet system of surveillance and informing functioned at its most fundamental level, how it relied on ordinary citizens to report on one another, and how even the most innocuous sources of information could be weaponized by the state. Viktor Petrov, the police officer who filed the initial report, was merely acting as the system expected him to. He received information suggesting a potential crime, and he reported it through official channels. From his perspective, he was safeguarding state security. There is no evidence that he ever expressed remorse regarding the report. There is no indication that he viewed himself as accountable for the events that befell the Kazakov family. He continued his service with the militia until his retirement in 1991. He passed away in 2003 at the age of 61. His passing was acknowledged in a local newspaper by a brief obituary characterizing him as a dedicated public servant. Mikhail Petrov, his son, has consistently refrained from commenting publicly on the incident. Efforts to contact him for interviews regarding the case have proven unfruitful. It remains unknown whether he is cognizant of what transpired with Dmitry and his family, if he carries any sense of culpability or remorse, or if he has simply chosen to move on from events that took place during his childhood. The facilitator, Gregory Leidv, was apprehended in 1984 on unrelated charges and sentenced to 10 years in a labor camp. He was released in 1994 and subsequently vanished from official records. His current whereabouts are unknown. The question of accountability in such cases is complex, as it compels us to attribute fault among individuals who, to varying degrees, were acting in accordance with the logic of the system they inhabited. Can a 7-year-old be held responsible for failing to comprehend the ramifications of his statements? Can an 8-year-old be criticized for entrusting information to a parent? Can a police officer be blamed for upholding the law as it was written? The probable answer is no. Yet this does not alter the outcome. It does not restore Anati and Elena Kazakov. It does not erase the years Dmitry spent in state care, pondering where his parents had gone. It does not prevent the overwhelming guilt that consumed him once he finally uncovered the truth. What the Kazakov case illustrates is the modus operandi of totalitarian systems. This occurs not through individual malevolence, but through the collective participation of ordinary individuals who genuinely believe they are acting correctly. Viktor Petrov was not a villain. He was a man who valued order, who thought he was safeguarding society. Mail was not malicious. He was a child who shared something with his father that seemed significant. Even the KGB officers who conducted the surveillance and interrogations believed in their own minds that they were protecting the Soviet Union from those who would betray it. However, the system itself was designed to eradicate anyone who attempted to defy its control. It thrived on fear, on surveillance, on the understanding that anyone could be watching, that any conversation could be reported, that any deviation from acceptable conduct could lead to arrest. Dmitry and Elena Kazakov desired a different existence for their son. They wished for him to grow up in an environment where he could express himself freely, think freely, where his future was not predetermined by party loyalty and ideological conformity. They were prepared to risk everything for that possibility. But the system they sought to escape was omnipresent, infiltrating every facet of life, transforming even the innocent words of children into instruments of state control. By the time Dmitry comprehended the cost of his words, the Soviet Union had disintegrated. The KGB had been disbanded. The ideology that had justified his parents' execution had been discredited. But none of that mattered to him. His parents were still deceased. His childhood had still been stolen. The guilt remained unbearable. In the decades since the collapse of the USSR, narratives such as the Kazakovs have gradually emerged from the archives. They are documented in historical journals, in academic studies, and in the memoirs of survivors. They serve as poignant reminders of what life was like under a system that prioritized control over freedom, ideology over humanity, and the state over the individual. There is no monument dedicated to the Kazakov family. Their names do not appear on any memorial. Their story is known solely to those who have investigated KGB files from the 1980s. But their case, like thousands of others, represents the human toll of totalitarianism. The lives obliterated not by war or famine, but by a system that transformed ordinary people into informants and ordinary conversations into evidence. Dmitry Kazakov was 7 years old when he made an error. He was 18 when he died, convinced he had caused his parents' demise. And between those years, he lost everything.